Welcome to Mex Moves, our weekly podcast on Mexico business and finance for interest for the US market. This week we have two great interviews. One with Pedro Casas. Pedro is the Executive Vice President and the General Manager of the American Chamber of Commerce here in Mexico. And he's going to talk about American companies operating in Mexico under the threat of tariffs and why he's optimistic for the medium and long term that Mexico and the US are much stronger together than apart. And we also have an interview with Sarah Hayden. Sarah is Head of Business Development at Aviva, a Mexican credit lender and fintech. And Sarah's going to talk a little bit about what's it like being an American working in Mexico City. Before we go into those interviews, Eduardo and I, as usual, will talk about some of the things we found interesting this week. Eduardo, how are you?
I'm doing well, Damien. How are you?
Good.
There have been a few interesting developments, news on the private equity side of the equation. I'd like to highlight the merger of these two private equity funds that you know a lot as well, Damien. I'm talking about Nazca and Bridge. Merging, I think, is one of the first or the only mergers that has taken place between two private equity funds in Mexico. They're joining forces. I think they both have things to offer to those that are trying to raise capital from private investors. And they are now partnering and creating a $300 million private equity company that it's hoping to maintain high returns for their clients. I find it that it's a new development in this industry where companies are joining forces to try to reach a broader both savers or investors and at the same time trying to fund interesting proposals on enterprises that are out there.
That's right. I think you shared an office, right, for a bit with Bridge?
I did for a little while with InfoCell. Bridge was in the same office as we were.
So Nazca's it's had great returns. They were a very early investor in Kavak, the used car platform, and were able to exit their investment at a very strong return. And they also did very well with Luna and the mattress company. So they've had 30% plus IRRs in their earlier funds. And Bridge is mainly a founders fund. A lot of the venture partners, founders of firms like Bitso and other very successful startup in Mexico. So you're bringing together two funds that are quite prominent. Nazca, because it's older, having had very good returns. Bridge is newer, so hasn't had yet the exits, nor was that planned, but it has a strong pedigree. I think it also reflects that the fundraising environment is challenging here in Mexico. The authorities are mainly investing outside Mexico in private equity. So in order to get money, both from authorities, family offices, and international organizations, it's better to be bigger. It's better to have concrete cash-on-cash returns than Nazca offers. So I think their goal is to be very focused on early startups and to be the sort of the leader in Spanish-speaking Latin America. And sort of 1 + 1 is 3, not 2 in this particular case. And obviously wish them all the luck. Mexico needs a vibrant VC sector. We've talked about it in the past, and I think some consolidation makes sense for all the different players.
Correct. And then there was this other very interesting news about Televisa investing in a fintech, Univision, may I say. That is not very clear exactly how much, whether it's cash or whether it's equity for media advertisement. I'm talking about the joint of Televisa Univision with Ulala or...
Voila. So they announced an extension of their Series E, another $66 million. And they named Televisa Univision as, I think it was the only name that they put in the press release. And in subsequent communication with the firm, they've said that 20% of the extension was from Televisa Univision, so maybe $12-13 million in media for equity. They haven't said, to the best of my knowledge, who the other investors are, but they have done a fantastic job in raising money. I think they've raised about $366 million or so, with a valuation of $2.75 billion. So most of their business is in Argentina. They did buy a bank in Mexico, ABC Bank. The numbers that we see in Mexico for Voila, and for that matter, most of the other fintechs are not especially inspiring. They've lost money last year. They continue to lose money in January, and their credit portfolio is very, very small right now. So they're still very much at the beginning of their journey in Mexico without many results to show for it. In January, we also saw numbers from Klar, which is, unlike Walla, is a Sofipo, and Nubank, which is a Sofipo and Story. And all of them lost money. And in case of Nu, which is by far and away the biggest fintech, and Sofipo in Mexico, don't see a lot of evidence of the asset quality is improving, or their non-performing loans remain on an adjusted basis at 21% or so. You know, the challenges are still there in Mexico. They're not yet turning a large amount of capital that's been deployed in Mexico into meaningful, tangible profits in the country. I think they would argue that it's still early days. I think the skeptics would argue that Mexico, because of the prevalence of cash, very powerful incumbents like BBVA, Banorte, Santander, is a tougher market to crack than Brazil's, for example. The regulators are much more risk-averse here and have made life more difficult for the fintechs, and then the prevalence of cash obviously is a hindrance when you don't have any branches yourself, and the digitalization of money is perhaps less appealing when 85% of transactions under 500 pesos are in cash in Mexico still, and we haven't had a sort of the equivalent of PIX in Brazil hasn't really taken off here. The Demo and the Coli haven't really penetrated in anything like the way that PIX has penetrated in Brazil.
What do you think Televisa gets out of the investment, Damien?
Well, they already were an investor through media inventory in Walla. So I guess in this particular case, it's to avoid dilution.
Okay.
And in addition to that, the TV companies have a lot of unused inventory of ad space. So if you're going to be able to swap that ad space for equity, why not? If it's not going to be otherwise used. So I don't think that they're forsaking revenues when they give the ad space to Walla. And I don't know if you watch Televisa, but you know, Walla ads are pretty common now. So they've clearly got quite a lot of inventory there.
And that makes for Walla, it makes sense to have this media presence, as their brand name will be probably expanded heavily in Mexico, where a lot of people still watch television. You're right. For Televisa, there is really no downsides other than they have the inventory. So why not? Let's keep our position in the company as the one we had before this new round of capital raise. So makes sense. Anything else you saw in this week, Damien?
There was an interesting story in Bloomberg this week on Dr. Simi going global. I think most people are going to be familiar with Dr. Simi. That's the mustached dancing mascot of Farmacias Similares, which has become a kind of cultural ambassador for Mexico after Harry Styles danced with a Dr. Simi. Adele apparently has according to Bloomberg story, has collected hundreds of the Dr. Simi mascots or dolls. They were in her book, in fact. So they're, according to the Bloomberg story, they're moving into the US. They launched an online store in March of this year, starting with vitamins, some OTC products, and some Dr. Simi plushies. And they've opened an office in Austin, Texas. A distribution center is coming soon. They're working with CVS Health to place branded displays in areas which have big Latino populations. And in August, they plan to open a Similandia store. So there's very much focus for Dr. Simi to be a bridge with the US Latinos, especially the Mexican Latinos. They have already 10,000 stores in Mexico, 500 in Chile and Colombia. So this is a logical expansion. I mean, they're not without their controversies, because obviously the founder of Farmacias Similares, Victor González Torres, he's the brother of Jorge Emilio González, who's the founder of the Green Party in Mexico. And the Green Party, which is now allied with Morena, the ruling party in Mexico, has historically proposed laws that favor generic medicine, and therefore have favored Farmacias Similares, which mainly sells generic medicine. I think in 2003, a while back now, they pushed for compulsory licensing of patented drugs without emergency declarations, which the big global pharma companies weren't too happy about. And then in 2010, perhaps better known, they promoted the Ley Simi, which is patients could use vouchers in private pharmacies when there were shortages. So they are politically very well connected in Mexico. And the son of Jorge Emilio González, El Niño Verde, it's quite, I think it's fair to say it's quite a controversial
Figure.
here. But they are clearly brilliant at selling generic medicines, vitamins, and other such products. And the marketing of the pharmaceutical chain through the Dr. Simi mascots has been nothing short of brilliant, although I understand it was not specifically planned. It kind of almost happened
organically,
yeah. But it's become a kind of global phenomenon with Harry Styles and Adele and some of the others.
It's interesting, yeah. I think it also shows that he tapped the needs of many Mexicans to get some, not just medicines, because they also offer some consulting next to the pharmacies, and that shows that the Mexican health system is not in the best of all places, to say the least. He, with the help of his political brothers, managed to capture a very large market that Mexicans more and more go to get their medicine and get some consulting, some medical advice from the doctors that work next to the pharmacies. So it's a very interesting story, controversial and all, and now trying to penetrate the U.S. market, which has obviously its own peculiarities, I'm sure.
Yeah, and then some disappointing economic growth out of Mexico. And actually, I read a JP Morgan report, and to quote it, it said, "We now think a recession is unavoidable in Mexico." And I think that's the first major kind of global investment bank that's calling for an economic recession or predicting an economic recession in Mexico. And that's JP Morgan is expecting GDP to shrink by 1.5% in the first quarter of this year, and they're now looking for full year GDP growth of negative 0.2% from positive 0.4%. So there was bad data in January. The proxy GDP came out negative. Industrial production in Mexico now has had several months of negative growth, and the consumer is also slowing down, having been very strong, and really what carried the Mexican economy into last year is also showing signs of weakness. And when you hear this podcast, the central bank would have taken its decision on interest rates, but most people are now expecting, if not everyone, that there will be a cut to 50 basis points, and that's on Thursday, and that's likely to be followed by another cut of 50 basis points, given the weakness in the economy. And clearly the economy is weakening. I think you have the Trump tariff threat, which we're about to hear from in more detail from Pedro, which is putting a lot of investment on hold in the industrial sector, kind of pausing the nearshoring phenomenon that had helped Mexico so much. But in addition to that, you have this fiscal hangover from the elections last year. So the deficit was running last year at 6% of GDP, which is way above a level that's consistent with stable government debt to GDP. So the government is now aiming to cut the fiscal deficit to 4% of GDP. So that's quite a significant fiscal contraction, 2 percentage points of GDP. If they achieve that, then you have the change in administration. And even if it's the same political party, tends to slow things down, approvals and new people in Pemex, new people in CFE and so on. Everything takes a bit more time to happen. And then you have, of course, the government's, the previous government and this government's approval of the so-called Plan C constitutional changes, most importantly, eliminating the autonomous agencies like the energy regulator, the competition regulator, and basically the elimination of most of the judges and replacement with elected judges that are likely to be quite partial to Morena. That's happening in summer of this year has created a fair amount of uncertainty as well. So we've kind of had a perfect storm between Trump and this Plan C constitutional changes, the fiscal hangover, and then on top of that, the U.S. economy
is slowing down.
Is slowing down, partly because of Trump and partly maybe for other reasons. But all of that put together it's according to JP Morgan at least, is likely to drive Mexico into a recession this year.
The interesting thing about that call is that it's done even without the tariffs that Trump might or might not put on. So JP Morgan is the first one to actually bring it down to a negative growth rate because of the way things are, let alone what might happen if we face higher tariffs.
Well, it's a real pleasure to have with us today Pedro Casas. Pedro is the Executive Vice President and the General Director of the American Chamber of Commerce in Mexico. If I'm right, Pedro, the American Chamber has about 1,400 members, all of the top American companies operating in Mexico and many of the leading Mexican companies as well. First of all, Pedro, congratulations on today's General Assembly. I was there. I must have seen over 1,000 top business leaders in the ballroom organized by you. Must be a relief that it's now over. What are your main takeaways from the event? What stood out from you?
Well, during the event, we discussed the main topics of the bilateral relationship as it is today. We discussed topics related to trade, to migration, security, and also social and cultural affairs with Patty Hinich, who just recently was named by the Washington Post as one of the 50 people shaping American society. And obviously, she's the only Mexican in the list. And through her cooking and restaurants and so on and so forth. And basically, my overall assessment and summarizing a 5-hour event is that we are under a lot of pressure due to the narrative war. I think that we are under some political leadership on both sides of the border that are pushing their own agendas based on beliefs and narratives more than data. And so that brings a lot of challenges on several issues, mainly the ones that I just mentioned. But we need to learn, at least in the private sector, if we want to play that game, we need to make sure that we're capable of shaping a winning narrative that could potentially balance out what we're seeing by the political leaders.
And what is that? What do you think that narrative is or should be?
We so far have been really good, and by we, I mean the private sector, to share the data related to everything related to trade and the business relationship between US and Mexico. And so far, also from what we heard during our General Assembly by Kristen Soltis Anderson, she's a pollster based in Washington, and she was telling us, look, when we ask American voters about the US-Mexico relationship, everyone in the political spectrum, to more or lesser degree, some or others, but everyone is mostly in favor about the trade relationship with Mexico. The fight, quote unquote, that the US-Mexico leaders need to win is not there. So we've been good, at least in that. But now we've seen under President Donald Trump that a lot of the topics are being mixed all together. We are putting tariffs to work on migration issues. We are negotiating with tariffs for security reasons. And so since those topics are being mixed up, I think that we need to actively engage on at least those two topics, from which, historically speaking, the private sector has not truly been a leading actor on those two things, security and migration. But there's certain ways that we could be part of that conversation and trying to reach certain levels of agreements and dialogue between everyone who's at the table negotiating these issues.
Do you think the American public, Pedro, is fully aware of how big a market Mexico is for US companies, based on your experience at the AMCHAM?
Probably not. With my experience, not only leading AMCHAM, but also as a former Washingtonian, whenever I was on any type of discussion with people of Congress or even like regular American citizen, there is no understanding of how fundamental Mexico is for the US economy, not only today, but if we want to keep on growing as a region, but the United States, if it wants to reindustrialize, Mexico is a key factor for that. I keep on saying that America first is not America alone, and it's very clear who should the American people be working with, and it is Mexico.
Pedro, it's very interesting what you're saying, because I do remember hearing Carla Hills, remember the first North American free trade negotiator for the U.S. government, speaking about how little knowledge the U.S. had in general about the jobs that depend on Mexican buying U.S. goods. And I think the data, as you said earlier, is your side. If we were speaking to a rational person on the other side, the data would make no sense to punish Mexico with tariffs. But we are, or you are, or companies here are facing emotions or narratives, as you call them. So is there a two-pronged strategy on your behalf, on the American Chamber of Commerce behalf, of trying also to appeal to the emotions that are driving this antagonism against the integration of North America?
There absolutely is. It's a project that is just about to be kickstarted. We don't have the information yet. We're about to deploy that strategy because we understand, at least we understand, that we do not understand that part of the equation, right? We know that we don't know how to approach that through emotion. And it has to appeal to different types of emotion because those that are placed forward are different on one side of the border and the other. I think that the Mexican economy and the Mexican people look to the United States on a way different approach and perspective than the way that the average American looks at Mexico. And one of the things we learned today as well is that at least on the Republican side of the spectrum within the narrative and the thought process of the United States, they do see as a positive way to use tariffs, at least to start a negotiation that can land on different outcomes, at least on security and migration, even though they rationally understand that they're going to have a negative impact on prices, on accessibility to different products, and many of the other issues that we can easily discuss in terms of the economic impact of tariffs. They're aware of that, but they're also aware that they're probably willing to sacrifice that in the short term if they can achieve other results on the other two topics that we've discussed.
Interesting. Are you seeing, from your perspective, a freezing of investment, a standby attitude until that short-term pain for long-term gain gets resolved?
Yeah, to be quite honest, I do see it. Probably is not a freezing, it's just a cool down, but it's not exclusive for Mexico. I think there is a overall sentiment, globally speaking, that things are starting to cool down a little in terms of investment, because what we're about to see on April the 2nd of tariffs that are actually a threat to the world, not only to Mexico or Canada or China, is actually a global threat. That has made that many companies are holding back, waiting to see what the outcome is, waiting for the dust to settle, and then start making decisions. As I said, not only for investment in Mexico, but worldwide.
Right. What about a little bit of what you were telling us about this culture element that the American Chamber is driving at? Is there any soft power that could be used to change the U.S. perspective on Mexico? We are also the good guys in the trade equation in the sense that we don't subsidize products, we don't require technology transfer. We've been playing by the books, if I may say so, but we seem to be compounded with those that don't. Is there a way that that message could be driven?
Yeah, I'll split my answer on two parts. First, on the we're the good guys part, that is definitely true. And I think that is going to get even more clear in the next few weeks and months. Why? Because I think that the new Mexican administration under President Sheinbaum has a more clear approach on the commercial relationship with China, for example. For the past 6 years under Andrés Manuel López Obrador administration, that was more of a gray area. The Mexican government was not so much clear on if we were going to be part of the decoupling from China, or if we were going to be kind of a bridge of Chinese investment into the United States. From my perspective, that message is now pretty clear, and Mexico is being a US ally, and it's going to decouple as well from China and from other Asian countries. So I think that that part of the message is going to become more important in the days and weeks to come. On the other side, more on the soft power part of it, I think that Also, we do have all the elements to really push a soft power cultural integration narrative forward for many reasons. But one of it is, look, Mexico is the home and is the host of the biggest US diaspora in any country in the world. And at the same time, and this is more of public knowledge, the US is home to the biggest Mexican diaspora. We have a societal and cultural integration already. Many states in the United States, the majority of its population is now Hispanic, and most of it, more than 70% of that, is of Mexican origin. Texas, California, New Mexico, Arizona. And that, in terms of voters as well, could potentially shift the political narrative, because now they can elect and shift the balance into one party or the other.
Right.
Pedro, I wanted to take us away from tariffs for a moment. A lot of American companies that you help represent have very big businesses in Mexico, whether it's Procter & Gamble, Avon, Coca-Cola, Uber, Netflix. And Mexico, in some of those cases, is their second biggest market after the US. And often Mexico has higher profit margins for those companies than they have in their home market, maybe because they have bigger market share here, maybe because operating costs are lower as wages are lower. What do you think American companies kind of get right about Mexico? Why do you think they've been successful, the ones that have been successful? And what are some of the mistakes or errors that you've also seen through the eyes of the American chamber that American companies, when they come to Mexico, some of the mistakes that they can make?
Yeah, look, the clear winners in this, the guys that made things right, are all of those companies that truly integrated and made the commercial relationship between US and Mexico more of a co-production system than only a trade system. And let me explain. A trade system is simply buying and selling finished goods. I think, yeah, there's some good in that. Obviously, the American market is huge. The Mexican economy also is quite big. And so that relationship could potentially yield positive outcomes. But whomever understood that we could find competitive advantages of building some part of the supply chain in Mexico, some other in the United States, and understand that the two economies are actually complementary to each other, and building a co-production system, those are the ones that are gonna endure for the next several decades, and who will actually be the biggest winners of whatever comes after Donald Trump's trade policy, because that level of integration is undestroyable. I've heard an example, and it's a metaphor that it's really, really accurate. Whomever is entangled in that type of system is like an scrambled egg. You cannot unscramble that egg and put it back in. It's already been done, and it will be that to the end of the next many years. Who did it not so good? As I said at the beginning, those that did not really integrate it. Some industries, within some industries, when you analyze kind of the legal framework of USMCA and you compare to the level of tariffs or duties that you could engage with if you decided not to comply with rules of origin, for example, and go with the most favored nation tariff that is under WTO, it was so low that there was not a true incentive for companies to say, well, I should go and comply with rules of origin and some other parts of the framework within USMCA. Those that took that approach for the past 30 years, they could manage that levels of tariffs, because we're talking about a single digit, probably 2 to 3% tariff that you could easily manage to still be competitive without complying with that. But now that the rules of the game are actually changing quite drastically, and those tariffs are going to potentially be now 25% or probably more, then not complying with the integration of your production in the United States and Mexico combined might have been a very bad mistake.
And are you afraid, Pedro, that if the US does put tariffs on Mexico on April the 2nd, for good, as it were, that there might be an anti-American sentiment in Mexico? We've seen it in Canada, obviously saw it last year in France, boycotting Starbucks after the Gaza war. Do you think we could see a boycott of American products here?
There's a risk about that. Not necessarily, because I think there are two potential outcomes. There are many potential outcomes, but let's just focus on the one in which there are tariff imposed. There's obviously the outcome in which the United States decides not to impose tariffs on Mexico, but if they do, there are two scenarios. One is one in which Mexico gets X amount of tariffs, of duties, but at the same time, the rest of the world, or at least our major competitors, get more tariffs than Mexico. That is one very highly likable scenario. If that happens, that would mean that Mexico would keep on being more competitive than its competitors. And so the imposed tariffs won't be as damaging as if, in the second scenario, we receive the same level of tariffs that other countries received as well, or even more. If we get to that scenario in which Mexico could potentially, through the eyes of many Mexicans, be treated unfairly, then there is a risk of having that anti-American sentiment present back in the Mexican society. And just to finish this comment, let's just remember that anti-American sentiment is something that has been pushed aside, I would say, in the past 30 years. Back in the day, at the beginning of the 90s, where we were about to sign the original NAFTA, probably close to 70% of the Mexican society was against it. And there was a huge anti-American sentiment in Mexican society. But in the past 30 years, that has probably flipped. Nowadays, I would say that around 70 to 80% of Mexican society has a positive view of the United States. But there is a 20 to 30% ghost within the Mexican psyche that could actually be triggered back again if things derail. I hope that doesn't happen, but there is a risk.
Pedro, let me ask you, is there any risk? You say yes, that if tariffs come to Mexico like it does to the rest of the world, that Mexico could still be a very interesting place to grow and set up here. However, the South, Texas, is south of the United States, is a region that sometimes competes with Mexico. Not that the wages there are as low as they are in Mexico, but I've heard of people moving to Texas, as a few companies have, or are looking for places where they could settle up in Texas because of the danger of duties. And a 25% duty would probably shift them to the northern side of the border. Do you see that as a major risk, or am I exaggerating?
I don't see it as a major risk for two things. One is that, as I said previously, if Mexico gets a 25, 20, 10, 15, whatever level of tariff, my take on this, because it's logical through every possible angle, is that other countries that are competing with Mexico will actually get at least the same level of tariffs or more. If we were to get the same levels of tariffs, the growth and development of the United States, even in Texas, goes hand in hand with Mexico. If you see historical data, I heard this from Dr. Luis de la Calle, former Undersecretary of Trade, when you see manufacturing growth in the United States, historical data, it always has close to a perfect correlation with growth in manufacturing in Mexico. We are moving in the same direction. If you would see increased levels of investment and growth in Texas, that will most likely be accompanied by growth in Mexico as well. And the other way around is also true. So I don't see it as a major risk.
Gets lower tariffs or no tariffs, and Trump goes all in on a North American fortress region, which is what we hope will happen, maybe as soon as next week, maybe later on. American companies see Mexico as attractive, part of the US, Canada region. 130 million people, younger people than the US, and a lot more potential purchasing power going forward. How can the American Chamber help an American company develop the Mexican market? What can you do for them?
Look, we've been around. The American Chamber of Commerce was founded 108 years ago, same year as the Mexican Constitution. We've been able to navigate and get to know the Mexican ecosystem for more than 19 different presidents in Mexico, 22 in the United States. And through building trust, putting forward proposals, putting forward data that is actually helpful for the Mexican administration to make smart decisions, to navigate also the relationship with the United States. We've won several seats at the table that are highly valuable on these days. One of them is, for example, the CADER. CADER is the acronym for basically the Business Advisory Council that President Sheinbaum founded a few months ago by the end of last year in December. And we are one of the 16 members of that advisory committee. We are consistently trying to advise the president, put forward, as I said, proposals, data, and information that could guide Mexican industrial policy, Mexican trade policy, and Mexican foreign relations with the United States. So that is one thing, being close to the Mexican government, which obviously, I'm telling you, kind of the highest decision table in which we're at, but that obviously goes down to the relationships that we have with all the cabinet members. We have a good relationship with Marcelo Ebrard, who, in terms of the economy and the private sector investment, is the leader in this country. And we try to build a strong, trustful relationship with him, as well with other cabinet members on several key sectors such as energy, health, and much more. So just to summarize my answer, Damien, I think that the way that we can help companies is by being part of a super strong binational business community that is capable of bringing problems and solutions to the table and helping our companies to navigate this ecosystem, which is quite unique against any other ecosystem in the world. You just need to be close to someone that knows how to approach things. And I think that eases out the way of many companies that are trying to invest in Mexico.
Eduardo, any last words?
No, Pedro, I think it's been very interesting to get your perspective on what's going on and what the future holds for the two countries. Thank you for your time. And we'll hope to talk to you again later on as this relationship continues to grow back and forward sometimes, but hopefully always ahead.
Thank you, Damien, Eduardo, for your time. And just a final thought. After all these noise and uncertainty that it's reigning in every sector of the binational relationship, I truly believe that a great and a clear winner of this will be Mexico. In the medium to long term, Mexico's position with the United States, its relationship, the co-production system that I've been talking about, it's something extremely hard to rip apart. I truly think that will just get stronger and stronger through time. Investing in Mexico is one of the best decisions one can do at this time, even though it sounds counterintuitive due to the noise. But invite me over in 5 years or 10 years and you'll prove me wrong or not. But I truly believe that's going to be the scenario.
We'll take you up on that, Pedro. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to have with us today Sarah Hayden. Hi, Sarah. How are you?
I'm well. How are you, Damien?
Sarah is head of business development at Aviva, Mexican fintech. We'll hear more about Aviva in a moment. Sarah, the subject of today's podcast is American companies and American people working in Mexico. You've been here, I think, 4 years.
Yes.
Tell us a little bit, what's it like as an American working in Mexico? What are the differences between working here and working in the United States?
Sure. As a little bit of context, I've worked for a couple different types of companies in Mexico. The first one being a multinational, but always as a local hire for a local team. After that, I came to work for you for a bit, which is a Mexican company, but with a foreign founder. And now I'm in a Mexican company founded by Mexicans. So I've seen a little bit of everything at this point. And when I was thinking about what the main differences are, I think you can sum it up one way, which is Mexico is a lot more relationship-based, and that influences the entire working culture. To give just a simple example, you would never start a conversation by saying, hey, I need this from you. Absolutely not. You would say, hi, how's your day? How was your weekend? And then you can get to the work topics. And that same attitude that starts with how you begin a conversation is basically the basis for your entire working career, and what you're able to accomplish and not is going to be dependent on how well you can build relationships and maintain them.
So when you came here, you obviously had some expectations of how working life would be in Mexico, and then the reality interrupted.
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about the gap or the differences between what you expected and what happened. Have things gone more smoothly, less smoothly than you expected?
I would say, on balance, more smoothly. But that was because I was exposed a little bit to Mexican work culture in Washington, D.C. I had the chance to work with some really brilliant Mexicans, but who had been raised in Mexico and had very much that mentality for work. And what do I mean by that? I was very aware my communication style was very different from a communication style of someone who is Mexican and who works in a Mexican company. So that was something I was aware of and tried to work on from getting here, which I think helped made it smoother. And then I also knew that it was going to be important to be able to cultivate some of those relationships, because in the United States, work is work. You leave work, you forget about it, it's 5 o'clock, bye. In Mexico, that's not really the case. It's a little more fluid. And I think in some aspects, knowing that helped me, but I also didn't master it completely, right? One thing that I wish I would have done in some of my former positions was cultivate those relationships earlier, especially from a manager perspective. In the US, managers are managers, and you really don't interact with your peers on a social level. I mean that the people that you work with, the people on your teams. In this work culture, it's much more common to have more of a relationship with the people you work with, and it's actually very important to the dynamic of the team.
Hi, Sarah. In your experience, I mean, you haven't been that long in Mexico, but 4 years, it's sufficient time. Have you seen changes in that, or is it pretty much the way it was from the very beginning? Have we changed in terms of our culture in Mexico?
Sure. It changes from sector and industry. So I've worked in management consulting, in PR, and now I work in business development, which means a lot of things at Aviva. And Aviva is also a Mexican startup. It's a fintech. I would say in companies that are more traditional, that you'll find in management consulting and the companies that you're working with, that cultural tendency that to do business based on who you know and to make sure that you have established that relationship ahead of time is more common. As you move away towards startups and innovations, it's easier to build those connections, but I would say that team dynamics are often influenced based on how well you're able to get along with your peers.
So by the dynamic of the industry changes a little bit of that
Yes.
dynamic, and how did you adapt it to that? What would you tell to someone that is coming to Mexico how to adapt to that? What do you need to change?
Work on your emotional intelligence. The first thing you can do if you want to build a career in Mexico, and I think it's valid to do so, and we can get into that, about why it's important to have international work experience, but I think it's essential that you start to learn how to study people and pick up on those nonverbal cues. That's very typical in this culture, is a lot of what's said isn't said with words. It's said with tone and how they interact with you afterwards and before. And so I think if you can study that, it would be very helpful. And then I also think it's important to make friends in the company, because you are going to need help. You're going to make mistakes. And so suddenly Nancy from accounting might be your best friend because she knows how to work with your boss and you're still learning. And that's okay, but you really do need to become friends with Nancy in accounting to be able to interpret that correctly.
Do you think that women get treated differently in Mexico of the same position and experience than men? And do you think that is different to how it works in the US?
Yes, women get treated differently in Mexico. I think there's benefits to that and there's downsides to that. And I also don't think all of that applies to foreign women. My policy on that personally has been to just proceed, to focus on what I'm supposed to be doing, to advance on that. There are certain things that I would say this culture is a little more careful of. And for example, we have a lot of physical kiosks all over Mexico. In 6 different states of Mexico, there's 42 of them. And I will say most of where we are is safe, right? But the road to get there necessarily isn't safe, or at least isn't safe for an American woman or a woman in general traveling alone. And so our team is much more conscious of that, and we'll be sure to make sure that, you know, if it's me or the architect or the head of product, who are all women, they are conscious of that and they're either going with someone else, and it's just a little bit more of taking care of the team, which I really have appreciated that as someone who doesn't have the full context. And, you know, other concerns of, am I able to do business in this country as a foreign woman? The answer is yes. When it's needed, I don't get into if people are ignoring me because I'm a woman. I simply say, okay, what's the most effective way for me to communicate with this person or how to get the job done? And it might be that it's something I can handle, or I might ask a more senior colleague to help me with, but the goal is always to move the ball forward.
What about frustration levels in terms of, I'm frustrated sometimes with Mexico's bureaucracy and the need to please someone just to get ahead. Is that something that in your case has been something you have to understand and deal with it?
Yes, there's a saying that my partner uses a lot, which is el que se enoja pierde. The person who becomes annoyed loses. And I think you have to fully understand that statement to stay in Mexico long term. I have lots of friends who have come, who have worked, and who have left. And I've outlived most of my American friends at this point, 4 years into this time living in Mexico. And it's because you have to manage your frustration, and you have to be able to appreciate the wins and the things that are unique about Mexico and the things that are lovely about Mexico. Because if you focus on bureaucracy and red tape and the fact that you didn't understand something and your boss is frustrated at you and you don't have enough context to understand why they're frustrated at you, you will leave. You will leave within 2 years, I guarantee it. So if you want to stay longer, you have to work on your frustration.
And I guess at some point there is a thin line where the culture forces you to adapt, but at the same time you need the culture to move, or you need sometimes to be tough on your team, or be demanding on your team without hurting sensibilities. Yes. No, that's a tough line to
walk. Yes. And my advice on that is always do it with kindness and never stop being direct. There's a way to be direct and kind. And if you're going to manage people and you want them to perform at your level of expectation, give them lots of feedback. They're probably not used to having that much feedback, so do it gently. You know, it would be, one example is sending a press release back to someone who wrote it. In America, would send it and say, please fix, this is all wrong. If you want to actually get results from your team, it would be, please come sit with me, let's talk about it. Let me go over line by line about what we would like to work on together, and then repeat back to me what you understood. And then your job as a manager would be to reinforce that line again and again, still being nice. You know, you don't want to say this is awful ever. You want to say, Marianita or Ilse, please explain to me what you misunderstood when I asked you to never put in double spaces, right? That's how you would phrase that.
You've been here 4 years. You've known Americans, or Brits for that matter, that have been much longer. How do you see the new arrivals? Are they different to your cohort? Are you different to the previous cohorts, or do you think basically it's a pretty similar group of people from beginning to end?
It's a great question. I know you, and I know quite a few journalists who have made their careers here. I mean, the Reuters team, some of their more senior members have been here for 10 years. And I'm thinking of some of my close friends who are Americans who have stayed. And I would say there is a difference. I think the biggest difference is those who are recently coming here maybe don't have the language skills, or they don't consider that as important. Whereas everyone I know who's been here long term obviously speaks fluent Spanish. It was essential back then, and I think it's very important now if you plan to do business here or advance or have real friendships. I think it's essential. And I also think the newer cohorts are looking for a quick payout, especially in the startup community, and that's natural. They hear Mexico's a huge market, there's 70 million unbanked people, let's do fintech. Great, wonderful idea, that is a problem. However, it's a lot harder than you think, and it will require a lot more than perhaps they're taking into consideration in years and years and years of work. And so I think a lot of people who come with that mentality are those who don't stay.
Let me ask you something about, do you see any difference between ages in the Mexican working groups as well? I mean, are the younger Mexicans more straightforward than the older Mexicans where you need to be less careful? Is there a change also in the Mexican workforce that you've noticed?
Absolutely. I would also say a lot of it's influenced by the fact that there are more Mexican students studying internationally. And so they have more international experience, and so they're more used to other working styles and other working cultures. They might have even worked in the UK or in the United States. I would also say that older generations can be more open-minded and more direct, and they tend to be those who have made careers for themselves, right? The senior sales manager didn't end up being the senior sales manager by being polite. He or she ended up in that position because they worked really hard, they figured out how to motivate a team, they were able to give feedback, and they were able to push everyone forward.
I understand that Aviva mostly offers small credits to middle to lower income Mexicans. In some respect, it's a misnomer calling it a fintech in the sense that it offers credits in these kiosks that you. Why do you think they wanted to hire an American? What do you bring to the table? Because most of your, if not all of your customers have very little to do with the United States.
Sure. I am our company's relationship person. If we need to consider, a new way to process payments because it'll be more efficient and it will lower cost and it'll be a better experience for our customers, I'm probably going to be the person to go contact 15 different providers and analyze their proposals. I'm also the person who I'm very good with senior management. I don't have an issue talking to one of our investors, and I'm really good at follow-up, right? So if we need to do due diligence, it's possible that I'm going to work on that due diligence because I will go find everybody in the company who has the information that I need, bring it together, synthesize it, and make it sound perfect in English, because that's also my native language. So I don't do any perhaps of the core business functions. I wouldn't necessarily have picked me to be head of product, for example, and I'm not. But I am really helpful when it comes to thinking about strategy and just getting stuff done and putting in place processes and making sure that what the CEO asks to be done is done correctly and done with a high level of care.
Sarah, that's been super interesting. I'm very sad that you're no longer working at Miranda Partners, but very happy that you made such a good career in general in Mexico and specifically at Aviva. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. Very interesting.
Great. So that's it for this week. Thank you very much for joining Mex Moves.
Thank you, everyone, for listening. I hope to talk to you or listen to us next week.